Welcome to Men Pursuing More, the podcast for men seeking purpose, growth, and fulfillment. I'm your host, Roger Maupin. In this July, we're stepping into a powerful series that honors the courageous men who paid a price in battle, yet refuse to be defined by their wounds. This month, Men Pursuing More proudly features Wounded Combat Veterans Month, a special tribute to warriors who face the horrors of combat and come home with scars, but not without strength. Their bodies may carry the weight of war, but their spirit unshaken. Wounded in combat, unshaken in purpose. These are the men redefining strength, not just for themselves, but for all of us. You'll hear stories of grit, faith, brotherhood, and the relentless pursuit of purpose on the other side of pain. From the battlefields to civilian life, these men continue to fight, to lead, to grow, and to live with impact. Their stories will challenge you, inspire you, and remind you of the strength that lies in never giving up. If you're ready to walk alongside some of the toughest men alive, men who have every reason to quit but choose to rise, then you're in the right place. Subscribe now and join us for this powerful July series. This is Men Pursuing More, and this month, it's about honor. It's about healing. It's about heroes. All right, welcome back to Men Pursuing More. I'm your host, Roger Maupin, and today we have Steve Otero joining us. So, Steve, let's dive right into your story, and why don't you share with the listeners about your experience growing up in Houston, Texas. I'm the kind of Dallas Cowboy fan. I don't know if you are, but and then
yeah, nice.
And then some of the highlights. That's right, America's team. And some of the highlights and challenges along your way growing up in the Houston area.
As I think a lot of people, Houston's a big city. If you're familiar with Dallas, then it's a huge metro area just like that. And I was a middle-class kid, lower middle-class kid. Dad was a cop, mom was a teacher, and it was the 80s. All those wonderful things that went on in the 80s I experienced. But I had a pretty normal suburban childhood for most of my young life. Unfortunately, my parents divorced when I was pretty young. I ran away from home for the first time at 13 years old. And I went back once and I bounced in between my parents' houses once. And then I ran away for good by the time I was 14. I was a troubled kid. In my teen years, I think a lot of us were, but I was a person who was so headstrong that I was look, you guys have a lot of rules and I don't believe in them. I don't agree with them. And I feel so deeply about that I'm willing to leave your household as a child, because that's what I was at 14. I'm willing to leave your house as a child, and I'm not going to live with either one of you. And I did live on the streets for a little bit, a few weeks to a month, I don't know, 6 weeks, something like that. That was not fun. I don't encourage that type of experience for anybody, but sometimes some of us do have that in our past. But again, we can't let that kind of stuff define us. And I didn't. I still went to school. I knew that one of the only ways that my parents were going to exert any more control over a person like me was if I didn't actually go to school, right? They could call a truancy officer, or my dad could try to use some of his connections to just come and pick me up. And I just wasn't going to allow that. So I was still a straight A student. I still made very good grades in school. I was one of those jerks that showed up to school on test days, and I would make a 95 on a teacher's test, and that I would skip the rest of the week. I think I was quite frustrating to a lot of my administrators and faculty at the time. I was a kind of a classic underachiever. And all my youth struggles led me down a path of finding a relationship that was the key to motivating me. There's not a lot a young man won't do for a person that he loves. And I fell in love as a young kid at 16 years old. And I recognized pretty quickly that the girlfriend that I had at the time was very smart, articulate. She was just bound for success as a person. And I was not modeling those types of traits at the time. But I knew, at least in the back of my head, that if I wanted to stay with her and I wanted to be a decent human being, that I needed to find some avenue of getting my life together and finding a pathway to success. And that's what led me to explore the military. I'd been told by a number of other people that, hey, if you're finding some challenges in life, you're a young person, why not join the military? Why not give it a shot? You never know what could happen. And so I did. So I enlisted at 17 years old. I had to have my mom's signature to actually leave for basic training. And I got my diploma, and 3 days later, I was on a bus to Lackland. So that the troubled childhood experience, just defined a pretty clear pathway for me to enter the military because I needed the structure and I was unwilling to accept the structure from any other traditional entity, like a parent or a grandparent or an uncle or something like that. I wouldn't listen to anybody in my family. I was pretty frustrated with all of them, I would say. But so many of us have challenges in our youth that lead actually, right? That lead us to pathways, that lead us to doorways to our own success. It feels like a pretty typical story to me. An 80s divorce led to a challenged teen, which led to that teen entering the military.
And so what was it like in the military where you're looking for that kind of structure from your parents and from others? And what was there some kind of challenges at first when you first entered the military?
Look, bluntly, I joined the Air Force, so it wasn't exactly the most intense or most difficult. I can admit this freely, completely. Air Force basic training was not Marine Corps basic training. It absolutely was not, and it never ever will be, nor should it be, by the way. It was still tough. It was still interesting to get used to a schedule, to get used to large men yelling and screaming at you at 4:15 in the morning about brushing your teeth and cleaning up a dorm room. A shared dormitory with 68 to 72, I think at any given point in time was the size of my basic training group. And I embraced it, actually. I think I was pining for some sort of structure, right? I was just really eager to find my place in the world. So many of us, especially as young people, we crave some type of reinforcement that helps us know and understand, hey, you belong here, you deserve this, you've worked hard for this, et cetera, et cetera. I loved the military. I think it was the greatest job that I'd ever had all the way up until the time I learned I was going to become a father. The U.S. military is the best choice I have ever made, probably in life. Again, other than becoming a father, other than marrying my wife and becoming a father, joining the military was the greatest possible choice I could have made for my life and my lifestyle ever. The military taught me structure. The military taught me discipline. The military taught me integrity. The military taught me how to actually be a team player. And it wasn't sports. It wasn't my parents. It wasn't some uncle. It was the military. It was the standard regimented structure of the day-to-day life and day-to-day activities of being a U.S. military member. And I fell in love with it. And I think that was maybe a challenge, maybe that caused some challenges in my own psyche as well. Because when I got hurt later in my service, it really destroyed my identity when I thought, okay, I'm not going to get to serve 25 or 30 years. When I was in the military, I was a person I was part of this whole sort of 4 to 5 year time span of people who were being overly prescribed medications. This is well documented, by the way. Anybody can go take a look at this stuff. We had some pretty big, serious hospital scandals. Madigan Army Hospital, AMC, the old Walter Reed. We had a number of overwhelmed medical doctors, medical providers that were seeing patients at a rate of under 60 seconds, right? Like most people out in the world don't understand how little time providers have with their patients. I do now, decades after these types of experiences that I had in the military. I fully understand now the challenges that the doctors faced during that period of wartime, because we were sending home hundreds of wounded military daily. And our wounded and injured numbers ticked up very quickly in a very short period of time. And a lot of us were exhibiting pretty pronounced, symptoms, excuse me. So a lot of us were exhibiting pretty pronounced symptoms based on like mental health conditions and then combining physical ailments and injury with mental health conditions. I had a couple of deployments, one to Iraq, one to Afghanistan. And
share with the listeners, what was your kind of position? I think we talked as a combat photographer, and just what entails that as you go off into, you said you were deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah, I was a person who embedded in other units. I joined the Air Force to deploy with the Army and Marine Corps mostly. My final deployment was actually with the State Department. I was a combat cameraman, so I specialized in using cameras as tools to support whatever avenues of the mission I could support. Sometimes that was forensic investigations. That was actually really what dominated the bulk of my military career. I ended up specializing in forensics. So that means basically like I can go and investigate crime scenes, and I can then go and testify in court on the images that I created, on the scenes that I was involved in. and any of the activities that I was involved in general. And it happened to me often. There were periods of time where I was already deployed. I was in Iraq and I got called back to DC to go testify for a court case where they needed me to testify in person. And we use that, the judge used that testimony to put somebody in jail for a very long time. And that happened to me multiple times throughout my 12 years in service. It happened to me in Afghanistan as well. So like I was a person who, even in a deployed environment, and this is really pretty rare, but it was just part of my job. Even in a deployed environment, somebody from stateside could just be like, hey, we need this guy back home for 3 days. And so boom, I would leave my deployed team, whoever I was embedded with at the time. I would go home. I'd do whatever was needed back in whatever place they needed me at. And then they'd send me right back to Afghanistan or right back to Iraq. And it happened to me a few times each trip. That's just because of the evidence that I created, right? I was involved in a legal process. They used my evidence to help put away criminals, terrorists, and people just doing bad things to other people. I loved my job. I got to see most of the military. That to me was the absolute most pleasurable part of my time in the military. I got to meet so many different military veterans doing so many different jobs and then help them tell their stories. That was really cool. That felt like a privilege. It felt like an honor. And especially when there are folks that were very hesitant to tell their story, maybe they worked in a more sensitive type of a position or sensitive type of job, but they were also maybe excited to share part of their story with their mom or share part of their story with their family and friends that they couldn't normally talk to about parts of their job. But at the very least, I would help certain types of people in the military tell at least a part of their story that they could. People are fascinated by anything classified, anything secret, anything, I don't know, if that feels very gung ho or whatever. That's why we have all these movies, and we always have, and we probably always will. But I took pleasure in trying to humanize the operator and trying to remind people that these are sons and daughters and brothers and sisters. And we're all very young people, usually, by the way, right? Like usually in the military, most of us are under the age of 40, usually, unless you're a senior leader. And then that usually also means you're not the person that's out there pulling triggers and kicking in doors. That's a job usually reserved for our 20 somethings, highly trained, most fit time of their lives type of people. But a very unique job. And I loved it. I was very passionate about it. I got to blend artistry with the rigors and intensity of military service and combat service specifically. There were some times that I was out doing combat patrols on the ground with the Army, and I would just see the light in a certain way, and I would take a picture, and then I would send that picture out to my government clearinghouse. They would clear all of our images and then release them to the public. And then I would see my picture sometimes picked up on some massive national news story, and 20 or 30 different news outlets would use my photos for their storytelling purposes. And for a lot of us, we have to be okay with ambiguity. Professional photographers right outside of the military sphere, they live on their name. They live on people knowing their name based around the images that they create. But for those of us who are photographers in the military, and especially in a combat zone, we did not even necessarily want our name associated with things. Some of us did, but a lot of us who were involved in operations on the daily, we just had to learn to be okay with ambiguity and to know that we were not going to ever be able to profit off of the creative work that we were developing. And that was okay, because at least we were the ones that were there, right? We were the ones that were embedded. We were the ones that were able to help tell those pieces of the story that may not have necessarily been told. So again, that felt like an honor and a privilege doing such a unique job.
And then once you came back from deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, I know you touched on this a little bit about your experience with PTSD and kind of some of the treatments, and then maybe go into also that process with dual action discharge and what that's all about, and just some of the maybe surgeries you had along the way. But how did you know that you had? Some of the listeners who want to know, like, how did you know you had PTSD? I mean, did someone point that out? Or
I didn't. No, I didn't. When I came back, I'm not a large man. I guess I'm 5'10", usually walking around 180 pounds, 175, 180 pounds. And I stay muscular. I stay lean. I'm still fit here 43 years later. That's just part of my lifestyle. But I came back and I was very stereotypical military male involved in ground combat stuff. And so I came home and immediately wanted to drink. Immediately. Like immediately wanted to use a substance that was available to me that was legal to help me sleep, to falsely relax. Right? I was lying to myself, telling myself that this substance was relaxing me. It was not. And then it was my wife. It was my spouse and my sister-in-law who was around us a lot at the time, especially after I came back from Iraq. It was the women in my life that pointed out, Stephen, you have changed. Stephen, there's something different about you. And again, I feel like I'm telling a stereotypical story because my story is not that unique. It just doesn't feel that way to me at all in any way. I was just some other veteran who was involved in combat. And when I came home, I started to have some nightmares. When I came home, I was on guard all the time. When I came home, I was angry. I was angry because I had dead buddies. I was angry because Americans seemed to be very raw about war and be very hyped up about it. And yet none of them were willing to sign up and join the military and go to war with me. Very few, at least, very few. But on TV, it was like the bee's knees. It was the best of the best. They're honoring everybody at the football game and they're honoring everybody at the baseball game and they're trying to show patriotic this and that and the other. And to me, it just felt like a total false patriotism for a solid, 15 years of my life. I am not one who believes in war. I do not believe in violence. I know violence. I understand violence. I can apply violence. I was trained to, however. And I think this sentiment holds true to a lot of us who've experienced extreme loss and extreme amounts of violence. We tend to despise it because it just, even though it can feel natural to us to solve problems with violence, it weighs on us. It weighs on our soul. It weighs on our spirit. And it doesn't feel good to have to go hurt somebody. There's a moment in time, I can admit, especially as a young person, where it feels good to know I am capable of this. That part feels good. I am capable. I am strong, right? With periods at the end of those, right? I am capable. I am strong. But to come back home and to think about the actual outcomes that are long-term, that affect families, that affect communities, that affect the global diaspora, right? Violence is not the best way to solve certain problems. We have to respond. Of course, I'm not giving anybody a pass. We had terrorists attempt to attack our country right in 2001 and multiple times since. Thankfully, nothing as large, but multiple times since. And I think it is only through that threat, it's like deterrence through threat, right? Deterrence through fear. We have more bombs, or we have bigger bombs, or we have more people, we have bigger people, we have stronger people, faster people. I don't know. It's probably that's why I moved deep out into the mountains where I live now. I'm not a person who is interested in conflict. I've had so much conflict throughout age 12 to, I don't know, man, 30, 35, really. There was so much conflict in my life. It is a much better day to wake up feeling refreshed and to know that, I'm not at the tip of any spear anymore. I'm a dad. It's my job to be a decent, balanced male in society, hopefully loving and caring are words that will be used about me when I die. I'm not worried about being called any other names, really. I hope to just be called, he was a loving and caring guy. Bless him.
Along with that, I was going to ask you a question about the PTSD. How did you kind of work through that, kind of where you're at today?
So, I guess I deviated from your original question there a bit. I can go down rabbit holes. Forgive me.
No, I think a lot of listeners would like to know how you work through it and how you continue to work through it, because it's probably something that just doesn't.
I think it's forever. I'll say those words about myself. I think it's forever. And the reason that I think it's forever is because no matter how many tools in my toolbox I have to manage both mental and physical health challenges, that doesn't mean that the challenges disappear. It just means that, at least for me, my perception is that they're at least lessened, right? They're dulled a bit. And to me, my little demons, I don't think are ever going to leave. I think they're here. I think they're just a part of me. I joke when I do talk to, I do talk to men's groups in my work capacity day to day, at different types of men's groups, whether they're older senior veteran groups or groups of young men at our university, our local university in Gunnison. groups of men, unfortunately, who've gotten in trouble maybe with the law and have been ordered to participate in a certain male group, maybe discussing their substance use or violence use, something like that. There was a TV show. What was it? There was a TV show, Dexter. Do you remember that show? Are you familiar with that guy, that character? Mm-hmm. He labeled a part of himself his dark passenger. And when I watched that show, that label like really resonated with me, because I've never really wanted to be violent, but there were parts of my job that demanded it. When I'm embedded with the Army, you don't say a damn thing. You do what the infantry does when you're embedded with them. When you're embedded with the Rangers, you do what the Rangers do. You don't ask questions. You ask questions to clarify maybe something, but that's well before the mission. But during the mission, you're just getting stuff done. I'm embedded with a lot of different tactical groups, some special, some not, right? And again, it was a privilege to see both worlds. And I have this still, even at 43, I have this lingering sense of loss that I don't think will ever go away. That is part of my PTSD. And that lingering sense of loss is sometimes the last thing I think about when I lay my head down on the pillow. And I have a very good sleep regimen now, but I did not 10, 12 years ago. Also 10, 12 years ago, my children were born. So that was a really weird thing to experience as a male who had just gotten off of actually a lot of psychotropic medication. I got off of all my psychiatric meds and pain meds back in 2012 when I was discharged. And that was it was a concerted effort by myself on my own part, because I recognized that I had a choice. Like I found out my wife was pregnant. And even in this sort of haze of lots of pills, I knew inside that like I did not want to be a dad who was showing my children that I got to take like 10 pills a day. That just seemed really weird to me, that I'm going to maybe show some young kids that their father needs to take 10 or 12 pills a day, but I otherwise appear healthy, right? I got all my limbs, that sort of thing. I got my eyes and my face and everything. I just knew I guess I was at least smart enough at that time to know, like, all right, the pill thing, which was Uncle Sam's recipe for me, by the way, but the pill thing is not working. I got to try other things. I have to find a different outlet. And I just need to be a decent father. There's no way in the world that I want to show these kids somebody who is dependent on a substance like that, whether it's legal or illegal. I'm not trying to show my kids that they should use a crutch.
And what are some things that you did to kind of help with that?
Sports, physical activity, right? There's no special sauce, right? There's no special recipe. We all need to find our own recipe for success. And as I got out, I moved home. I moved to Houston with my wife. Yeah, as you'd mentioned earlier, I'm just going to touch on this, but this is a piece of my past. As you mentioned earlier, I left the military under what's called a dual action discharge process. Because I live in Colorado, some people here have told me that they're proud of me when I say this, but I may admit here on a recording that I'm exceptionally conflicted about this. But there are people here in Colorado that are very proud of me because I'm the first ever honorably discharged military veteran who used cannabis to get sleep, to try in an attempt to control my PTSD. And I used it while I was active duty. I admitted it immediately. And I presented my case to an NCO board. I was a staff sergeant at the time. I was an E5. And I simply showed the board, look, I chose to use a substance because all of the other substances that your doctors were giving me did not work. And other than committing suicide, which was actually the activity that I was involved in at the time that I was offered the substance, a friend of mine found me in a garage with a noose around my neck, summer of 2010-ish. And that same friend, I was in Germany at the time, that same friend offered me, he just constantly had marijuana cigarettes. And over there in Europe, they mix their marijuana. They split it like half and half tobacco, half marijuana in a cigarette. And so he had offered me this, and I was literally sitting there crying. I had a piece of rope around my neck. I had not thrown the other piece over the rafter at the time, but I was like, I guess I was rehearsing. That's what psychologists had told me that I was doing. I was rehearsing the act, trying to gain the courage to actually complete the act. But really the number one thing that was holding me back at the time was the potential for my spouse to have found my body. I didn't want to leave her with that. And that truly was the thought that stopped me from completing the act. And I was in a full blown like mental health crisis here. So I ended up going to a psychiatric facility for 6 weeks after this, and had a lot of intensive therapy, and had a full decade of therapy after this as well. I love therapy. I love therapists. Even if people find a coach, people find a friend, right? A mentor, somebody to talk to, right? Find somebody to talk to, even if it's not a therapist. But I felt alone because I was an airman who was a combat airman. And when I was going back to my unit, it was not a combat unit, right? And a lot of people had rotated out, and I was like one of only 2 people who had ever deployed into combat. It was a small unit, small team, but still it was very isolating. And none of the spouses could like really support my spouse, because most of their spouses, at least in general, had not been to combat, like maybe one or two. And so most of those airmen had never had that experience. And so they did not necessarily know how to empathize. And I can't hold that against anybody, but it was just a really weird and isolating environment at the time. But I presented my case. And interestingly, this is the funny part, and we're going to move on right after I say this, but the US military actually prescribed me marijuana. The US military prescribed me a consumable form of THC called Marinol. Marinol has been available over the counter for, 40 years, something like that. It was a drug that was first developed for cancer patients. It was considered antiemetic, anti-nausea. It was a decent substitute for some. And that medication was prescribed to me by an Army, active duty Army lieutenant colonel, pain management doctor who'd been a pain management specialist for 25 years. And he was like, look, dude, like, why wouldn't we just prescribe this to you if you said that it brought you relief? If you say that it helped you sleep, if you say that you had less pain, why wouldn't we prescribe this to you? And so he did. And that took me from 12 medications, no exaggeration, like 12 different substances per day down to 2. One was the Marinol, the THC substance, the THC pill, and the other was Prilosec for my stomach, because I just always had this like acid reflux, I think from the PTSD, from being in a constant state of fight or flight, constant anxiety, constantly thinking that somebody might try to hurt me. So I needed to always be on guard. But, like I said, I fought and I won in a sense, but I was not allowed to stay in the military, but I still earned my honorable discharge and my full benefits, and moved on with life with a pregnant spouse. That was pretty intense at the time. And then we found out we were having twins, which made it even more intense, of course, that we were going to have 2 little ones instead of just one. But admittedly, I think life worked out beautifully, perfectly. We began to draw down in the years after I got out, and then fully pull out of Afghanistan shortly after. By the time my kids were like 5 years old, we were fully pulling out. And during the first 5 years of my kids' existence, I definitely was still struggling. I tried my best to hide it so that they didn't see an enraged man, but I still made sure that I had a counselor. I still made sure that I was becoming more physically active again. I had a series of surgeries on my way out the door as well, on my way out of the military, mostly for my abdomen and then some for my back. So when I was in Iraq and when I was in Afghanistan, I came back and I had hernias. So just from running around doing silly stuff, wearing probably too much heavy stuff, picking up and carrying and moving too much heavy stuff. But I had really good medics out there, and they knew how to make hernia girdles. You could use a 6-inch ACE bandage, and you wrap it around your thighs and your abdomen, and you pull it up tight. And I used to call it my hernia. It was my hernia diaper. And, but at least it kept me put together in a sense to where I could continue to just go do the mission. And I've been blown up a few times. I have it on video. The number of small explosions that I've been around is truly comparable to somebody who works in a mortar position or an EOD position, or because I was deployed with EOD. I was literally embedded with the Navy Mobile Unit 3 for 6 solid months. And those guys are Navy special operators, and we were blowing shit up every day. And then again in Afghanistan, I got pulled in. One of my old team sergeants, who was an Army EOD guy from Iraq, I ran into him in Afghanistan, just randomly at a base way out in eastern Afghanistan. And he saw me. He was like, Sergeant O. And I said, what's up, sir? And I got a mission. I said, okay, let me check in with my commander. And so even in Afghanistan, my EOD my former EOD teammates they'd found me and they were pulling me into different missions, going to go blow stuff up and going to go stop terrorists from trying to build up weapons caches so that they could then move them forward deeper into Afghanistan. So we worked a lot of border stuff and did a lot of interdiction missions. We were stopping suppliers from trying to bring materials over to build IEDs or just straight up bringing RPGs over, mortars over, that sort of stuff, landmines over. So I know that I have a traumatic brain injury. I've had a couple of different nurses and doctors diagnose me with it. Unfortunately, that also has long-lasting effects on a person's psyche and our personality. And I feel that it has taken, what is it, 2025? I feel that it has taken a full 15 years because that's what it's been now. Today, it's been 15 years since I've set foot in combat. And here in this 15th year, I definitely feel better than I have than before. But it has taken a lot of self-work, right? It's taken a lot of work with counselors. It's taken a lot of work through physical surgeries, interventions, things to correct hernias, things to correct nerve damage in my lower abdomen, in my lower back, and then trying to rework a sleep cycle. I was a person who used to exist on 2 to 4 hours of sleep a night. And that, I think, also was really driving me insane. I was going crazy.
You were made for more clarity, more confidence, more impact. At Maupin Coaching, I help high school and college athletes master the mental game and guide men into purpose-driven leadership. Grab the sports book, rock that merch coming soon, and step into more at maupincoaching.com.
Okay, so for me, really to sum up PTSD, I look at it like Dexter looks at his dark passenger. That's how I approach that part of my own mental health. It is a piece of me. It's a part of me. It'll always probably be a part of me. And I can continue to grow and develop well beyond that. I will not allow a mental health challenge from my past to define my future. It does not have to, unless we allow it. So that's how I approach that.
I appreciate that. That's powerful. So I think there's many that need to hear that and what you just shared. And it's not like it just goes away, but hey, I'm going to work through this. I'm going to continue on. You get your family, you get your kids. And then as you move forward, I know we talked a few weeks ago about share with the listeners about participating, being involved in the Warrior Games. And I think you've been a little more involved besides just participating. And then eventually attending school and kind of your position now. And I know you've been involved in kind of hosting a podcast too. So I know that's a lot, but go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. The U.S. Air Force did their best to support guys like me, I think, through their Wounded Warrior programming. If people don't know, all 5 branches of the military have a dedicated Wounded Warrior support team, right? And so anybody who is identified as wounded, ill, or injured with a potential recovery timeline of being greater than 6 months can qualify to receive support services through the federal Wounded Warrior programs. And because of the length of recovery of my injuries, the Air Force Wounded Warrior program reached out to me and extended an olive branch to say, hey, we'd love to bring you out to San Antonio and teach you about all these different adaptive sports that we're doing, because we still want you to be physically active, even though we know you have some injuries. It was during the time that I was invited out to go and train with this group of other wounded vets in San Antonio and Washington, D.C., and Southern Colorado as well. And the military had paid for us, a small group of us, to go and train a few times a year and then provide us some coaching as well. Even when we weren't co-located together, like at one event, we were still at home in our own respective areas, hopefully training and doing whatever it is we need to do to participate in an annual event called the Warrior Games. The Department of Defense has hosted the Warrior Games, I think since 2010, 2011. I participated in 2013. And I focused on shooting. I was a pistol shooter, a competitive pistol shooter. And I did okay out of, 80 or so participants. I think I finished top 8. I was number 8 out of 80 or so participants. And so that was interesting. I'd always fired standard weapons, but I'd never fired a 177 pellet air pistol, which really, it does up the challenge. It very much forces a person to focus on form our breathing, our patience, our ability to truly remain calm, and then to time the shot. Our bodies have a natural movement to them. Even when we think we're not moving, there is still movement going on inside of us, simply because of the beating of our heart and the cardiovascular system. I really enjoyed it. It was a beautiful experience to be invited to wear a uniform of my service, to represent my service again, competition with a bunch of my fellow wounded warriors. And very shortly after I participated in the Warrior Games, the same Federal Wounded Warrior Program, the Air Force Wounded Warrior Program, offered me a job. And I laughed at it then. I laugh at it still now, because they offered me a job without even having a job title for me. They didn't know what they wanted me to do. They just knew that they wanted me to be a part of their team. And that alone was probably the greatest compliment I've ever received. It was like a validation of, look, I'm not like just some struggling jerk. I'm a struggling, decent human who is working my butt off to like actually be as healthy as I can again, to get my mental state back in a balanced fashion, and then to just feel good about life again, to have that gusto, that zest for living, that zest for life. I think a lot of us crave when we don't have it. And sometimes when we have it, we overlook it. And we don't even realize we have it, or we're in the thick of it. We're in the thick of a very joyous time in life that is fleeting. And so I worked for the Federal Wounded Warrior programs for about 3.5 years. I did end up becoming a leader, led the communications and marketing team. And shortly before I left that position, I was involved in helping turn that position from a contractor position, right? I was a contractor. I worked for Lockheed Martin, but to solidify the position, I knew that I wanted to work it administratively into a GS, government civilian paid position with full federal benefits and everything like that. And so I laid the groundwork and the foundation at the senior leadership level, at the Pentagon level, to turn it into a GS-12 position. And so very shortly after I left, the gentleman that we chose to replace me, thankfully, he was able to move from contractor into GS very quickly because of the groundwork that we laid. We justified the position and showed senior leadership, hey, this is a valuable position. Like, you want to tell the story of all these wounded vets participating in these sports competitions, because their stories of resilience really are going to matter to the American public. They're going to matter to people, because these are moms and dads and cousins and sisters and brothers, right? These are regular folks that are doing some pretty amazing things to help themselves get healthy again. I left the position because I was craving a new experience. I wanted to go back to school. I wanted more training. I needed to do something different. And so I left the position in 2015, and I moved to a high alpine mountain town called Crested Butte, Colorado. And in 2015, I felt like a little wanderer again, for a little bit at least. And then I discovered NOLS, the National Outdoor Leadership School. National Outdoor Leadership School was started by a military veteran who came back after World War II. His name is Paul Petzold. It's one of the oldest outdoor schools in the entire country. And most people don't know this, but the U.S. military veterans, are responsible for the ski industry here in this country. Unfortunately, that series of sports, winter sports, gets more and more expensive and less relatable, I think, every year. But the reality is, this was started as just a mode of transportation in the mountains by soldiers needing to carry heavy stuff and to go fight the Germans. But a group of enterprising veterans came back and realized, like, hey, like, this is also fun. And if we co-locate areas of opportunity to do this, maybe we can also make some money. And so anyway, one of those vets started this outdoor school, and I knew, just because of my mentality at the time, I knew that I needed to approach school in a non-traditional way. And so I went and I spent 3.5 months out in the wilderness with NOLS, and there I call that my civilian basic training. And so it was 3.5 months with a group of 18 to 24-year-olds, and I was 34, 35 at the time. And I, in my head, I thought I knew some things, right? I was accomplished. I'd done some things. I'd been some places in the world. I'd seen some stuff. Yeah. But an 18-year-old male who did not have knowledge on how to manage his feet, right, carrying a heavy load over long distances, was probably actually one of my best teachers. And the reason that I say that is because I started my relationship with this person in an abrasive manner. I questioned him. I was like, why don't you know how to take care of your feet? What's wrong with you? An attitude, very stereotypical old military male attitude, and the wrong attitude, by the way. Had I approached him, right, as a bit of a teacher or a coach, I would have made a friend, right? I would have potentially gained another confidant in my life. But it took a couple of weeks, and thankfully I had good coaches and teachers from the Knowles cadre, and they showed me the error of my ways. So I had to relearn how to communicate effectively and in a different style. And that's truly what I gained mostly from that 3.5 months outside with Knowles. There were a lot of technical skills. There's climbing, there's rafting, there's rappelling, there's all this. There's a lot of technical outdoor skills, medical skills, EMT skills. We learned a lot. There was a lot of academics packed into that 3.5 months. But the reality is that 3.5 months taught me how to communicate with people in a much more effective, calm, rational manner. In the military, we use this, we knife hand people, right? We put our hand out, and especially when we're in a supervisory position, it's like, hey, we got to go get this stuff done, right? The mission comes first. We got to go get this stuff done. Go now, execute. But in the civilian sector, it is just different. And 15 years removed from the military, I love it. I'm so grateful for it, and I appreciate this style of communication now. But I just didn't necessarily appreciate it at the time because it forced a change in me. It forced a change in my approach to the world. And that can be jarring, unnerving. But I embraced it and then entered school, and I became an academic masochist. I triple majored in undergrad. Likely all of you listening who are American taxpayers, you paid for my education. So I made sure to make straight A's. I was not going to waste your dollar. I was not going to waste your penny. People tell me that I earned my education benefits because I joined the military and I went to combat. I don't look at it like that. I still recognize very deeply you, the American taxpayer, paid for me to go to school. And so I absolutely respected your dollar, and I made straight A's. Like I said, I was a triple major in undergrad. I was an exercise physiology major because I wanted to study the processes occurring during these times of physical stressors. Exercise is a pretty broad label. I was an experimental psychology major, and I was a recreation and outdoor education leadership major. And so I combined those 3 undergrad degrees to then move into my master's program, which was a master's in behavioral science. I love studying what motivates us. Right? How do we get that feeling where, especially when we're in a group together and we know we're all jazzed, right? We know we're all excited to go do this thing, to go engage in this particular activity together. And we all feel that pump, that energy and excitement together, which is a pretty amazing feeling. And interestingly, science helps show us that human brain waves actually sync up. When we get that sort of group dynamic feeling of all moving in the same direction, there's research out there that shows that the brain waves we experience will actually mimic each other. So we can put EEG on people's brains in a group, or we can put an even better technology called FNIRS. FNIRS is it's an infrared light, basically, that gets beamed into the brain. And we can look at portions of the brain which are becoming oxygenated. And when we've done these studies on groups of people, we see that the exact same parts of the brain become oxygenated at the same time and in the same way. So we as humans, we literally sync our brains up together when we're engaged in these group tasks, and we're like feeling accomplished, right? We're getting things done. So we link up energy-wise, which was exceptionally fascinating to me. I used the years from 2015 really till now to study and study hard, and to use every last education benefit I have to keep getting smarter, because I think that's the only way that I'm actually going to be a helpful human, is to keep learning, right? And to keep learning every day, and to be humble about it, because it doesn't matter how many letters I end up with at the end of my name. To me, what matters is how many people can I help? And if I can help even just one more veteran, like just be okay and access their own benefits, then that's a good day. My day job right now is as a veteran services officer. So I work for a county in Colorado, and my job is to make the county better for military veterans and our families living here. And so I do that through a variety of methods, from actually working on legislation with state and federal legislators, or working with community-based support programs, making sure that even our most financially challenged veterans are still able to access food, quality food, healthy food. Our most underserved veterans that are living exceptionally rural, like way out in the mountains on a piece of property, 30 acres, 100 acres, and they're all by themselves, and maybe they're 80, right? I work to make sure that those veterans know they do have benefits, and there are opportunities for them to gain access to more medical care, or gain access to counseling, gain access to some additional layers of community, because we all need it. So, in tandem with being a veteran services officer, I also host a podcast called The Nature of Wellness with one of my best friends in the whole world, a guy named Dr. Mark Campbell. Dr. Campbell's he's a performance coach. He was one of the first mental performance coaches hired by Major League Baseball. Dr. Campbell helped, start the Warrior Games. He helped start and develop these different wounded warrior programs within the federal government. Because he worked at the DoD level when I was working at the Air Force level back in 2012. And so 2012, 2013. And that's how we met. It was through doing things for both the Warrior Games as well as the Invictus Games. And so he and I are both leaders in our own respects, doing different things, but working in the exact same vein, which was getting veterans moving, getting veterans healthy, and just encouraging people to find new ways to take good care of themselves.
And just all that you've shared in the last 5-10 minutes about how many veterans maybe are not aware of this, or aware of what you're doing, not only in the county area, but what you're doing in the state of Colorado, legislative pieces at the state and federal level, and then your good friend with doing the podcast that other veterans can listen in, and just the resources that are available for them out there. And I appreciate that. I think there's going to be a lot of awareness when people listen to this podcast, which is the July podcast is all about veterans, combat veterans. And
cool. Thank you.
I thank you. I appreciate this because it's about your story, but it's also what you can do that, like you've mentioned it many times throughout this podcast, about how you can give back to others. And this is one of the ways to give back to others. So I just appreciate that from you and your willingness to share your story. Wrapping this up, I always have this question: what are your final thoughts that you want to leave with men as they continue their journey? But maybe it's more just kind of men, or maybe veteran men, or just veterans. What are some final thoughts you would want to leave with them?
I'm a humanist. So all those other labels that you just mentioned, they're just that to me. I just put people first nowadays instead of any other way around. It's hard to empathize sometimes. It really is hard to put ourselves in other people's shoes. But dare I say, that's one of the best activities we could ever practice, is to do our best to just take a breath, stop and think for a moment before we choose to respond with any vitriol, right? Or before we choose to react, with any sort of vitriol. Maybe if we find somebody saying some things and we feel that emotional response, right? That guttural response, to respond rather than react, or something that every counselor or psychologist or coach, right? Everybody in that field of bettering human performance and human wellness, everybody's always said those types of words in some type of combination, right? The response rather than the reaction is a way for us to truly share real thoughts and constructive feedback for and with one another. I do believe that especially young men may have different and greater struggles than I had when I was growing up in the 80s. I have a son right now who's 12, and he is not a large boy. He's a smaller boy, one of the smallest in his class. And so he's faced bullies. And as a father, it's a very challenging moment in time when your son comes home and tells you about his bullies. There's this visceral and guttural reaction of, let's go kick some booty, right? Let's go do some things, right, son? We got to go take care of business, right? There's that visceral reaction. But I believe the more mature reaction is to help that young man understand their place in the world at that moment in time. Because again, violence is not the answer. It never has been, and it never will be. And I know my military veteran brothers and sisters may try to argue with me on this, right? Because they say, whoa, what about this time? And what about this time? And we dropped a bomb here and that sort of a thing. I guess I'm not talking about those grandiose expressions. I'm talking much more so about the day-to-day reality of life. We always have a chance to use our words. And so we should learn our verbal judo skills, and we should enhance our verbal judo skills to the best of our ability for as long as we possibly can. I look at my life hopefully as having a health span. I'm not interested necessarily in my lifespan, right? And spending the last 10 years of my life in a hospital. I'm not interested in that at all. So anything and everything we can do together, we, the full collective we, doesn't matter if you're a veteran, doesn't matter if you're a female, doesn't matter if you're male, or anything else in between. I respect all of it. I don't care. It's not my business to care. It's my business, I think, to be nice and be polite as a human interacting with other humans out there in the world, because I'm just interested in that, right? I'm interested in being a decent human being. And I hope that others are willing and interested in being decent human beings too. We all can live enriched lives, but we all need some community. We all need some reinforcement. We all need joy. And brother, if there's nothing else I do in my life, it's definitely, I'm trying to find the joy every day and every chance that I can. Because without joy, what else is there? What are we doing all this for?
All right, Steve. Hey, thank you so much for your willingness to share. And where can listeners find you and follow your story? I know it's going to be here at Men Pursuing More podcast, and I know you have a name of a podcast that you.
Yeah, we're at the Nature of Wellness on Instagram. I'm sorry, I can admit to the listeners too, I'm not a social media guy. You're not going to find me. You want to come find me? Come up into the woods up in Crested Butte, Colorado. You'll find me on a trail. You'll find me walking around some mountaintops. That's where you'll find me, or you'll find me on the river. You can very easily find me on the river. But natureofwellness.buzzsprout.org is where our podcast is.
And they can probably search up your name too and maybe find the podcast possibly too.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Hey, that's a wrap with Steve Otero. And I want to thank you for being a part of Men Pursuing More podcast.
Thank you for doing what you're doing, Roger. I appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day.
Hey, thanks for listening to Men Pursuing More podcast. Don't forget to follow us at moffencoaching.com.